Blackburn Rovers won the Premier League more recently than Sega has been number one in the console market. The brand's gaming legacy and the fun it has delivered over the years means the many Sega systems from yesteryear still have a firm place in players' hearts to this day. While we have already discussed many of these in depth on here in the past, today I will do something that I have never done on here before and rank every Sega home console, add-on and retrospective library of games from worst to best. I wonder whether you'll agree with me. I'm sure my number one choice will shock and upset you, or perhaps delight you. Let me know. Anyway, without further ado, I am Lady Decade and this is ranking every single Sega console and add-on. In the last place, I'll place a piece of Sega hardware that most people will not even be able to remember existed. While many people out there believe that this Sega Dreamcast was the company's last home console with its own physical library of games, the truth is that is incorrect. This accolade instead goes to the advanced Pico BEENA. Released in Japan as late as 2005, this edutainment system focused solely on education for children, including titles supported by licensed animated characters. As an adult, you will likely not have fun with this one unless something is wrong with you. Topics listed as educational focuses for the BEENA include intellectual, moral, physical, dietary, and safety education. BEENA was chosen because Sega Toys felt it sounded like Be Natural. Despite its obscurity, the hardware sold relatively well, with over 4 million BEENA units in the wild and an additional 20 million game cartridges floating around. It's probably not worth playing, but it's a fun piece of history. It's no surprise that I am placing the original Sega Pico on this list, as it is yet another edutainment console that doesn't serve up traditional gaming goodness. Still, I think this one has the added cool factor. It is 16-bit and was on the market at the same time as the Mega Drive, even outselling the classic system in its homeland of Japan, where education is of great value. The 1993 system would not sell as well overseas, but it has a lot of remarkable curiosities, which include the likes of Sonic games and even Pokemon. It's insane to think that Pokemon could be played on a 16-bit Sega console, but never on a Nintendo one unless you use the Super Game Boy. Speaking of Pokemon, if you want to know something even crazier, they even released a special Pikachu edition Pico, which means you can get a Nintendo branded Sega console. What is this madness? While many often mistake the Dreamcast for Sega's last console rather than the BEENA, the same can be said with their first console, with many believing it all started with the Sega Master System. The Master System may have been the first console released by most Western companies, but before its release, Japan and a few other regions had the much more primitive Sega SG-1000. Designed to be cheekily released on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, the SG-1000 featured a similar architecture to the United States ColecoVision. The SG-1000 offers crude, basic graphics compared to all other Sega systems, supporting 76 ROM cartridges in total, with later models supporting the 29 MyCard games. The platform is less memorable than some of the company's later offerings, with a few rushing out to buy this rare gaming hardware. Still, like any console, it has some cool gems, such as Girls Garden, one of Yuji Naka's early games before he became famous later in life as an insider trader and criminal. This 1983 console was Sega's first baby step into the console arena. In 7th place on my list, we have the Sega 32X add-on. I suspect a placement that some consider controversial, as it has a significantly smaller library of games than the SG-1000 and Pico. It is also often credited as one of the mistakes that led to Sega's hardware manufacturing downfall. Released in 1994, Sega of America created this mushroom-shaped monstrosity as a low-cost option for gamers who wanted to enter the realm of 32-bit gaming at a cheaper price point. Designed in response to the Atari Jaguar and to extend the lifespan of the Sega Genesis, the final design contains two 32-bit central processing units and a visual display processor. failing to attract third-party developers due to the announcement of the Saturn's simultaneous launch in Japan. The 32X stood little chance of ever succeeding. Pair this with the fact that it was rushed to market, cutting development time, and the platform would end up selling terribly with only around 40 games to its name. Though at least there are a fair amount of decent ones out of these, the 32X is still the only home console platform that Knuckles Chaotix can play on. So the 32X and Knuckles, what more can you ask for? Well, it's not enough to be close to first place on my list. In 6th place, we have the Sega Mega Drive's other console add-on, the Mega CD. Again, while it didn't quite live up to the hype surrounding it, the Mega CD still has charm. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Wait for Nintendo to make one? With its bombastic ad campaigns, the platform brought CD-ROM technology to Sega hardware for the first time. If crude FMV games such as Night Trap and Sewer Shark aren't your thing, there are still plenty of high-quality, more traditional gameplay experiences to be enjoyed. Take Final Fight CD, for example, a home port of the arcade classic that outclassed its Super Nintendo equivalent in every way, and even added CD renditions of the game's brilliant soundtrack. Pair this with other excellent titles such as Kyo's Flying Squadron and Sonic CD, and there were good enough reasons to own a Sega Mega CD. In the middle of this list, we have the only Sega handheld gaming console with its own library of games, the Sega Game Gear. Technologically superior to Nintendo's Game Boy in every way, the Game Gear was a flashy-looking handheld that gave Sega the cool edge over their arch rivals. Sadly for the company, the Game Gear lacked the battery life, cheap price point, and library quality that the Game Boy had. But that doesn't mean the Game Gear doesn't have its own merits. Often mistaken to be a portable version of the Master System, an inference which makes sense when we consider they're both 8-bit, share many of the same games, and that the Game Gear even has a converter that allows Master System games to be played on it. In actuality, the Game Gear was graphically superior to the Master System due to it offering up a much broader colour palette than its living room predecessor. The Game Boy may have lived longer than the Game Gear, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an extensive library in its own right, with many great gems that never showed up on the Master System. It has its own Sonic games, Streets of Rage conversions, and bizarrely, a Panzer Dragoon game, even if it's not very good. The Game Gear was a handheld that brought colour to gamers' lives. From one 8-bit Sega console to the next, we have the Sega Master System. The people in the NES-centric United States of America often seem to fail to grasp what a great little system the Master System was, with a large portion of Europeans back in the day championing it as being better than the Nintendo Entertainment System in every single way. And that is without even accounting for how popular it was in New Zealand, Australia, and Brazil as well. For many, Alex Kidd in Miracle World was as impactful to them as Super Mario Bros. Were for Nintendo owners. That is before mentioning the array of Sonic games the hardware would receive during its years as the budget alternative to the Mega Drive. Almost ironically, the system's cool exterior was designed in the United States, revising Japan's SG-1000 Mark III to the darker, sleeker Master System in a move to make it more appealing to Westerners, much like Nintendo of America had done previously when converting the Famicom into the NES. Americans may not appreciate the Master System's radness, but the rest of the Western world certainly does, which is why I've placed it at number 4 on this list. Moving on to the big 3, I am placing the Sega Dreamcast in 3rd place. The last time Sega went all guns blazing in the console market to be the world's most popular video game company. The once world's most powerful game console was a truly mind-blowing piece of hardware on release. It not only offered up graphics that matched that of the arcade, but in many cases topped the arcade experience, such as with Soul Calibur 2 for example. Games like Sonic Adventure showed the blue RNA seed as he had never been seen before. Games like Shenmue offered up gameplay experiences that were so realistic and immersive that at points it didn't feel like you were playing a video game. All of this is without even getting to the Dreamcast's other capabilities, such as its innovative VMU memory cards which plugged into the controllers and built-in modem, which not only allowed us to surf online but in some cases enter chat rooms and game online for the first time ever. The Dreamcast was a console ahead of its time, even if sadly the PlayStation 2 cut its life short. For these reasons, the Dreamcast will permanently hold a place in the hearts of many. Perhaps my most controversial ranking on this list is placing the Sega Saturn at number 2, but hear me out. While the likes of the Dreamcast have their place in history in their own right, the Sega Saturn achieved something that no other console in Sega's history as a company managed to achieve. Defeating Nintendo in its home territory of Japan, successfully outselling the Nintendo 64. Due to its relatively poor sales in the West, the Sega Saturn remains somewhat of an enigma to many. While it may have had a limited amount of games released for it in most territories, in Japan on the other hand, the hardware offers over 1,000 games to choose from. Not only that, but while in the West most games of the era available on the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation offered up crude polygonal experiences, the Sega Saturn in Japan was a 2D gaming powerhouse. Due to this, Saturn owners have a treasure trove of high quality 2D fighting games and Japanese space shooters at their disposal. And that is before we credit all the classic heavy hitters on the console, such as Panzer Dragoon Saga, Guardian Heroes, Die Hard Arcade, Nights into Dreams, Virtua Fighter 2 and more. The Saturn is not just an underrated Sega console, but perhaps the most underappreciated console ever in the West, which is why it gets number 2 on my list. Number 1 on this list was probably obvious to every person watching this video from the very start. It would be tough to argue against the Mega Drive / Genesis not being the number 1 Sega console of all time. After all, this was in the era which the company was at their most popular, with them competing against Nintendo for market dominance and leading at points. This meant, for a period at least, the Sega Mega Drive was the most popular game console on planet Earth. An accolade no other Sega console can boast. This is why on each generation of modern hardware that comes out, we continue to receive Mega Drive Collection after Mega Drive Collection, with most of the company's other history left in the dust. The console that would feature as the home to establishing Sonic the Hedgehog showed the world that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, offering up some of the most tubular games that have ever been conceived. The Streets of Rage series, the Golden Axe games, Shinobi, Altered Beast, and Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker are all unforgettable classics etched into the annals of gaming history to be remembered for all time. I mean, what more can I really say? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section and watch my video about the Atari Genesis. Bye!